Good morning and welcome to Inquisition Update. My name's Tom Fress and I'll be your host for the next hour. Thanks for tuning in. And now, if you please, we will begin our reading and discussion, continue our reading and discussion of the book, The Papacy and the Civil Power by R.W. Thompson. Beginning with the first full paragraph on page 493 in the book, if you're following along, the last full paragraph on page 493 if you're following along, backing up just a paragraph or so for continuity this morning. It says, "It is well understood that in Germany, as well as in England, for many years before the Protestant Reformation, the ecclesiastical and political alliance, that is, the union of church and state, between the reigning monarchs and the papacy had been complete and comparatively undisturbed." So we have a church-state union in Germany, the king and the pope exercising their divine right to rule over the people, and you might imagine the people were subservient, held in complete subservience to this beast system. And it says, owing to the imbecility of some of the monarchs and the inordinate ambition of others, the German people were reduced through instrumentalities just like those employed in England to dependence upon the popes, who claimed that they possessed divine authority to regulate their domestic affairs also. See, that's what you get when you get a church-state system. The church rules the state, and the state imposes the tyranny of the pope. And it says, by virtue of their conceded power to appoint all the prelates of the church and to exact from them oaths of fidelity to themselves, speaking about the popes, they had succeeded in building up an ecclesiastical empire. An ecclesiastical empire within Germany. There's your shadow government. They built up an ecclesiastical empire which they maintained among the German people in entire independence of the government and its laws. A state of things precisely similar to that which Pope Pius IX is now trying to bring about. And remember, this book was written in 1876, just a few years after Pope Pius IX issued his encyclical and syllabus of error, condemning all of the republics that grew out of the Protestant Reformation. The papacy had been had been stripped of his temporal power, and the power was now vested in the people. And Pope Pius IX was trying to turn the tide and raise himself back up to his most loved position as King of Kings and Lord of Lords. And that's what Pope Pius IX was attempting to do. This book was written to warn the American people of what Pope Pius IX had up his sleeve, and he simply is showing us history that existed when the popes ruled supreme, both in England and in Germany, so that the American people would be fully apprised as to what was actually taking place in the world by Pope Pius IX. Now, the hierarchy, this Roman Catholic hierarchy in contiguous union with the government of Germany, which composed this independent body, was freed from all responsibility to the German authorities, no matter what enormity its members perpetrated upon society, or what the nature and extent of their usurpations. So they ran amok. There was no opposition. And it says they looked alone to Rome for the approval or disapproval of their conduct. See, these priests have their first loyalty to the Pope, and they don't answer to the civil government. That's just as true today as it was in Germany and in England at the time of the writing this, at the time of these events. And it says, whatsoever the Pope commanded them to do, again, we're talking about the shadow government, this ecclesiastical, hierarchical system that existed in Germany. It says, whatever the Pope commanded them to do, they did. peaceably if the people submitted, but forcibly if they did not. Such enormous power as this naturally bred arrogance and covetousness. And as the popes have at all times required large sums of money to maintain the splendor and magnificence of their courts, they employed it for the accumulation of large wealth, not only at Rome, but among themselves. So this shadow government, this ecclesiastical government of Germany, was fleecing the people of its money. Not only making them slaves, but fleecing them of their money. That's typical of every example that we've ever seen in the study of Roman Catholic history. And when the Pope rules supreme, the people are fleeced of their money. It goes to the church, and it goes to keep this hierarchical beast system in place. Now, with this wealth in their possession, these prelates became more and more exacting, knowing that they were esteemed by the popes in proportion to the extent of the contributions they levied upon the people. So they got plenty of encouragement from the Pope to fleece the people. Money is all that matters to Rome. Now, it is not at all to be wondered at that the German people, like the English, became restless and dissatisfied under the crushing pressure of such a burden as this. All the tendencies of their minds were toward freedom, in the defense of which they had always been in the foremost rank. But on account of their devotion to the Roman Catholic Church, and the belief constantly inculcated in their minds by the clergy that they were indebted to it for all the Christianizing and civilizing influences they possessed, they patiently endured their submission till they could bear it no longer. They at last came to realize that the question was simply one of life or death to their nation, that it was impossible for Germany ever to acquire an independent and commanding position among the other nations so long as this hierarchical power was permitted to maintain its ascendancy. And herein we undoubtedly find the real origin of the Protestant Reformation in Germany. According to Hallam, quote, its predisposing cause, unquote. Luther quarreled with the Pope about matters of religious faith, and when the people of Germany saw this vast power with all its ecclesiastical weapons drawn, threatening him with the terrible vengeance of the papacy, they took sides with Luther, not at first on account of his religious opinions merely, but because the time had come for them to assert their true German manhood and to throw off the yoke of temporal bondage which the papacy had placed upon their necks. And thus a single brave and unterrified man was enabled to multiply his army of reformers into an unconquerable host, whose ultimate victory over the Pope consisted not alone in the introduction of the Reformed religion, but in marking out new paths for modern nations, paths which pointed with marvelous precision toward that grandest achievement in history, the American Revolution. The Protestant Reformation in Germany did not immediately extend itself into England, for King Henry VIII, who was a bigoted papist, occupied the throne at the time when he had the power to resist its influence, and in order to keep himself in favor with the Pope, wrote a reply to Luther for which he was flattered with the title Defender of the Faith. In other words, Henry VIII vilified Luther, obviously, as a heretic. Okay? He was in rebellion against the power of the Pope and also against the religious tenets of the Roman Catholic Church. Luther was a true reformer. And, of course, King Henry VIII, a Roman Catholic, in order to butter himself up to the Pope, wrote a scathing letter to Luther. And he, in return, was labeled by the Pope as, quote, the defender of the faith. So it worked. So Henry VIII and the papacy at this period of time are tight. Okay? It says, it was his greatest pride to keep in existence in England the same exacting and ambitious hierarchy against which the German people were getting ready to rebel. Between these ecclesiastical princes and himself, there was perfect accord in this, that each should sustain the power of the other, that is, the king and the pope should sustain one another at every hazard, in order to keep the people in subjection and prevent them from having any voice in the management of public affairs. They were held together by the cohesion of a common faith, that is, Roman Catholicism, which taught, as had always been taught by the papacy, the divine right of kings and the divine right of popes above that of kings, which later enabled the popes as vicegerents of God to sit in judgment over all the earth, with the right to command whatsoever should augment their power, and to forbid whatsoever should curtail it. Like the people of Germany, those of England were held down by an oppressive weight of tyranny at the beginning of their Protestant Reformation. Now, Henry VIII was a vicious and unprincipled monarch, consistent only in two things: the constant indulgence of his evil inclinations and an equally constant adherence to the chief doctrinal dogmas of the Roman Catholic Church. He was never a pious Christian, except nominally, no more so than when he broke the alliance between the Church of England and that at Rome, than when he sought to win the favor of the Pope by hurling his royal and poisoned shaft at Luther's head. And he was never a Protestant, except only so far as he resisted the papal encroachments upon the authority and prerogatives of the English crown. Upon this subject, much of what is called history abounds in error and misstatements. It has led many honest minds into the belief that this profligate king was at the head of the Protestants of England. The papal writers are indefatigable in maintaining this belief in order to hold the Reformation responsible for his vices, whereas the truth of history is that he never professed to be and never was a Protestant in any proper sense of that term, but lived and died in the faith of the Roman Catholic Church. His quarrel with the Pope had nothing to do with the faith of the Church. It began about the divorce, but soon involved the question of ecclesiastical investitures, by means of which he found the Pope could maintain in England a power rival to his own, if not more formidable. Upon these questions, each supported his position with stubborn tenacity until the breach between them became so wide that it could neither be healed nor bridged over. The parties were about equal in pertinacity and ambition, neither of them having the slightest respect for the people or regard for their political rights. As none of the religious dogmas of the Roman Catholic Church were assailed by Henry, the controversy was simply a struggle for supremacy between the two sovereigns. One of them was the lawful king, and the other claimed dominion over the kingdom in right of divine appointment, and each of whom, to have secured his triumph, would have made galley slaves of all the English people. The final triumph which Henry VIII did win over the Pope only changed the form of English tyranny. It only changed its form. It was still tyrannical. He concentrated all the absolute power of imperialism in the hands of one despot instead of having it to be shared by two. It remained papal tyranny in substance, if not in name, by the preservation of that nefarious union between church and state, which had its origins in Rome at the time of Constantine, and which, wherever it has existed, has held the people in vassalage. So we've dispelled the myth and the rumor that King Henry VIII was a Protestant reformer. He was not a Protestant at all. As a matter of fact, I suspect if the truth were really known, Henry VIII wasn't even a good Catholic. He simply used religion to maintain his power and authority in England. And when he came to blows with the papacy over supremacy, he demanded that the Pope get out. And he wanted control of England, and he simply used the church to support that effort. King Henry VIII was not a Protestant at all. And history has given him far too much credit in support of the Protestant Reformation, which he only sought to use to help substantiate his independent status of the papacy. The Protestants, having thrown off the power and authority of the Pope, reduced him to Antichrist, which he indeed is, and King Henry just sought to use their influence to separate England from any papal interference at all in his kingdom. So that's that. Now, Henry VIII and Pope Julius II were both children of the Church of Rome, educated in the same religious faith and disciplined under the same papal system. With each of them, Pope Innocent III was infallible, and the persecuting decree of the Fourth Lateran Council was a part of the law of the Church. When Henry felt the pressure of the papal power upon him, he called upon the Protestants of Germany for assistance to enable him to resist it. But they refused the alliance because they had no sympathy with his cause and despised his iniquities. Julius, finding him thus unsupported, followed the example of Pope Innocent III in the exercise of divine power, hurled at his head the thunders of excommunication, and released all the English people from their allegiance to the crown, impiously pretending also that he stood upon the earth in the place of God, and that obedience to him in both spirituals and temporals was necessary to secure admission into heaven. The demon of religious persecution was unchained among the followers of these Roman Catholic contestants, each letting loose his own bloodhounds. And if the distinguished Moore and Fisher were cruelly murdered for their resistance to the English oath of supremacy, which did nothing more than place the king above the Pope, their triers and executioners were their own brethren, reared, educated, and nurtured in the same religious faith, Roman Catholicism. No drop of their blood stained the hands of a single Protestant Christian. The children of Rome shed the blood of each other with a ferocity akin to that of wild beasts. And even after all this, and before the blood of the victims had begun to dry, Pope Paul III, who, while cardinal, had taken the side of Henry VIII, made an effort to reconcile Henry with the papacy, there yet being no important differences of religious faith to separate them. And a like effort at reconciliation was made by the Roman Catholic King of France, at the suggestion, doubtless, of the Pope. The question, however, being one of mere supremacy in the government of England, Henry was not disposed to give up any of his royal prerogatives, and no compromise could be arranged. The Protestant Christians stood aloof from the contest, awaiting the results with anxiety, of course, and hoping that it would contribute to the strength of their own cause. Their religious faith received no encouragement from the king, and had the curse of the Pope resting upon it, so that when the final expulsion of the papal power from England was accomplished, the Church of England, under Henry VIII, still retained the leading tenets of faith it had learned from Rome. In other words, the Church of England was just as Catholic after the Pope was evicted and King Henry VIII declared the undisputed and unopposed King of England, it was just as much Catholic as it was before. He simply took control of the church and simply made himself the Pope over that church. Okay? There's just virtually no difference between the Church of England and the Roman Catholic Church, except the quibble of over what status the Pope has. Okay? So it's a Roman Catholic Church. And it says it continued to maintain the doctrine of the real presence of Christ in the sacrament of the Eucharist. It did not regard communion in both kinds as at all essential. It forbade the marriage of the priests. It preserved the Romish custom of encouraging vows of chastity. It continued private masses for the dead. It enforced the duty of auricular confession. It was, in fact, as much Roman Catholic under Henry VIII as it had been under Pope Julius II or Pope Paul III, except that it denied the temporal authority of the Pope and his right, divine or otherwise, to interfere with and regulate the domestic affairs of either the English Church or the nation. And Henry, to prove how faithful he was to his Roman Catholic training, turned his persecution against the English reformers, who were disposed to favor the principles of the Protestant religion, the influence of which was beginning to be transferred from Germany to England and to unite with similar influences already existing there. The torch and the rack, so familiar to Rome, were no less terrible in the hands of the English than they were in those of the Roman Pope. The difference was this only, that Henry VIII, having learned their use from Rome, employed them after he established his English pontificate in the torture of both Roman Catholics and Protestants. Who does not remember the account of 3 of each, coupled 2 and 2, who were carried out to execution upon the same hurdle? In a like spirit, he employed his royal power to prevent the teachings of Martin Luther from taking hold of the English mind, and punished those who openly advocated them and were suspected of doing so. The circulation of pamphlets and tracts written by Martin Luther was prohibited. He forbade his subjects to import, sell, and keep in their possession Tyndale's translation of the New Testament, quote, and ordered the chancellor and the courts to prosecute anyone that should disobey this command, and to punish with the utmost rigor of the law the abettors of the new opinions, unquote. That is, the Protestant opinions that were taking deep root in England and Germany. And if before his death he abated these persecutions, it was only because he courted an alliance with the Protestants so as to make his power more effectual in his contest with the Pope. He cared nothing for religion, but struggled hard for royal authority and supremacy. So we just have a war of the wills here. This has nothing to do with religion. Religion is just an opportunity to extend his power. Henry VIII was no Protestant. He persecuted Protestants and only took advantage of Protestants to gain his separation from the papacy. Now, we're talking about King Henry VIII of England and his rebellion against the papacy. And out of what we've learned already, we know that King Henry VIII only appreciated Protestantism for what it lent to his goal of becoming the sole supreme authority in England and not having to compete anymore with the papacy, to kick the Pope out of the civil affairs of England and so that he might rule supremely alone, and to be literally become the Pope of England. And we also know that after his attempted accomplishment of using Protestantism to help that cause, he would have persecuted and put down Protestants. He was not Protestant. He was Roman Catholic. And he only sought to maintain his Roman Catholic hierarchical governmental structure and just take it from the Pope and use it for his own. Protestantism was only a means to that end, and after it was accomplished, he would have persecuted Protestants. I think that's evident from all that I've read on the subject. Now, King Henry VIII cared nothing for religion, but struggled hard for royal authority and supremacy. But death, which strikes alike both the high and the low, laid its unsparing hand upon him before he could accomplish such an alliance, before Protestantism had become firmly planted in England, and while he was yet in all the religious faith he ever had, a Roman Catholic. True, he has extorted some praise from portions of the English people, and the poet Gray called him the majestic lord who broke the bonds of Rome. But these praises were bestowed because, quote, they saw in him not indeed the proselyte of their faith, but the subverter of their enemy's power, the avenging minister of heaven by whose giant arm the chain of superstition had been broken and the prison gates burst asunder, unquote. Although Henry VIII manifestly designed to build up an independent church in England, with himself at its head, which should be freed from the spiritual and temporal authority of the Pope, and the influence of the new doctrines of English and German Protestantism, yet it is undoubtedly true that he gave important, though undesigned, aid to both. But his persecutions, he demonstrated that neither could be suppressed by that means. But as he had learned these from Rome, whose dogmas have since the false decretals long before the decree of the Fourth Lateran Council always embraced as a part of the faith the doctrine that the Church was bound to maintain its organization and power by force if necessary, he continued them throughout his reign, seemingly unconscious that the papal power was too strong to be immediately broken, and that while he could torture the bodies of the reformers, he could neither take away from them the right to think nor subdue their courage. The immediate assistance he gave to Roman Catholicism was rendered by maintaining the leading principles of its faith. The English people, as we have seen, had been sufficiently subdued by the power of the hierarchy to become passively submissive to all their commands. Being deprived of the use of the Bible and shut out from all the advantages of intellectual culture, the masses, though clinging to their ancient liberties with intense affection, had not yet acquired that sense of personality which is absolutely necessary both to the establishment and preservation of popular liberty. They remained, therefore, many from choice, but a larger number from fear, still submissive to the dictation of Rome, while the nobility vacillated from side to side accordingly as their interests and safety dictated. Those remote from the cities, where the papal exactions were not so directly realized, were the most submissive, because they were the most ignorant, and were kept under the more immediate influence of the monks. Mr. Hallam says that the citizens of London and the large towns, quote, had begun to acquire some taste for the Protestant doctrine, and continues, quote, but the common people, especially in remote countries, had been used to an implicit reverence to the Holy See, and had suffered comparatively little by its impositions. They looked up also to their own teachers as guides in faith, and the main body of the clergy were certainly very reluctant to tear themselves at the pleasure of a disappointed monarch in the most dangerous crisis of religion from the bosom of the Roman Catholic unity, unquote. Upon the minds of this class, Henry VIII made but little impression favorable to his new theories. The belief, very properly entertained by them, that the divorce was sought only for the gratification of his passions rendered them disinclined to acknowledge his supremacy. And the monks, taking advantage of this, were able to keep them comparatively steadfast in their fidelity to the Pope. The king, having thus left the fundamental feature of their religious faith undisturbed, they remained at the close of his reign still under the influence of the monks, while the nobility and many of the higher clergy remained as before, ready to take the strong side, whether papal or Protestant. And thus Henry VIII did not do to Roman Catholicism half the injury that its advocates pretend, for it cannot be disputed that he left it possessed of great vigor and strength. What he did for Protestantism may be briefly summed up. He taught the nation that the papal scepter could be broken, and that the power and influence of the hierarchy could be checked, if not terminated, by compelling it to submit to the civil laws of the kingdom, as all other citizens were required to do. He put a stop to the enormous accumulation of wealth in the monasteries, which had so long kept the people in poverty and dependence. He opened the way, without intending it, for the further introduction of the German influence and of free thought. He inaugurated measures which led to placing the English Bible in the hands of the people. He taught the people the necessity of not forgetting that they were Englishmen and entitled to an English nationality without being passive subjects to the King of Rome, the Pope, either by temporal or divine right. And he established a system of measures which, in the end, however designed, steadily led them forward to a point of national greatness never surpassed by any people on earth, ancient or modern. Protestantism gained strength by these measures, and ultimately gave rise to many of the most cherished and important provisions of the British Constitution. It still holds the people of England true to their own national fame and greatness. And if they have not yet marched fully up to the side of the people of the United States in demanding the control of their own affairs, they have advanced so far toward it that they no longer fear to threaten royalty with their power, to hold the lash of public rebuke over their aristocracy, and to assert their right to that full and complete protection which now belongs to every free-born Englishman, whether he be a peer in Parliament, a mechanic in his workshop, or a laborer in the field. But a little while ago, the leading newspaper in England and of the world expressed this thought, quote, "There can be no union between the people and the possessors of unjust privileges, and the fight between them must go on until the people have won," unquote. It is the right to utter sentiments such as this that Protestantism has vindicated, and to which the policy of King Henry VIII unconsciously to him has led. To this extent, then, has he been made the instrument in the hands of Providence of serving England and the 19th century. And because of this, his memory should not be held wholly in execration. The elements of character were singularly mixed up in him. His training and education as a papist led him into errors, excesses, and vices, which we may condemn, even while crediting him with whatever of good he did. Providence often permits beneficent results to be educed from the evil designs of men. Protestantism would have lived and grown without Henry VIII, but God raised him up within the pale of the Roman Catholic Church, so that, becoming familiar with its policy and persecutions, he might the more effectually employ its own weapons to destroy its power to harness down the freedom of religious thought. But Protestantism in England had to gain strength by the gradual progress of the Protestant Reformation, which at every step was resisted by the Papists with desperate energy. During the reign of Edward VI, the son and successor of Henry VIII, several measures were adopted which aided materially the cause of reform and proportionately weakened that of the papacy. They were far in advance of any existing at the death of Henry. Masses were abolished, and the cup was given to the people in communion. Do you get this? The Roman Catholic Mass was abolished. That is the centerpiece of the Roman Catholic altar. The Roman Catholic Church stands on the Mass, and it was made illegal in England. Edward VI was a true Protestant. It says Masses were abolished and the cup was given to the people in communion. The jurisdiction of the ecclesiastical courts was abridged. Priests were allowed to marry, but these and other kindred features only incensed the papists to greater violence, and to avenge themselves they engaged actively in stirring up insurrections against the government. And you might believe they had the Pope's support for that. It says the insurrectionists in Devonshire, moved by the priests and the monks, set forth their demands in 15 articles and insisted upon the consent of Edward to them. In these they required what is now required of the people of the government of the United States. He's speaking of the influence of Pope Pius IX now in his encyclical and syllabus of error. This is what Pope Pius IX tried to do in the government of the United States. Quote, that all the general councils and the canons of the Church of Rome, we're talking about Roman Catholic canon law, that body of law that was brought about by the false decrees, okay? The Roman Catholics demanded that all the general councils and the canons of the Church of Rome should be observed. In other words, they wanted to replace the Constitution of England with Roman Catholic canon law. And this is exactly what R.W. Thompson asserts was Pope Pius IX's intent to do in the United States with his publication of the Syllabus of Error, to replace our Constitution with Roman Catholic canon law. And it says the immediate object of which was to restore the temporal power of the Pope. Okay? We're seeing a repeat in the United States of America what was attempted to be done in England. They're trying to overthrow Protestantism in this country. Protestantism is preserved and protected and given right by our Constitution and Bill of Rights. Protestantism is regarded as an abject heresy by the papacy. And the papacy will do all and everything it can to overthrow Protestantism in the United States. And the easiest way to do that is to corrupt the Bibles. And the other thing that they did was to call Vatican Council II and throw out a so-called bone of peace to the Protestants and bring them back to the Roman Catholic Church. Everybody wants peace and unity. Everybody wants the Christian religion to be one in Christ. But the ecumenical movement is not to make it one in Christ, but to make it one in Antichrist, the Pope. I hope my listeners can comprehend this from all that's gone on, what we're learning in this book and what's taking place currently in the United States government. The United States of America is becoming a Roman Catholic Church state, just like they rejected in England. And Pope Pius IX's encyclical and syllabus of error of 1864, which some Roman Catholics would like to downplay, is still being acted upon in this country every day by Roman Catholics in our government. Okay, he wanted all the general councils and the canons of the Church of Rome to be observed, the immediate object of which was to restore the temporal power of the Pope. Now, if after all that we've learned so far, would we dare allow the Pope to exert his temporal power in this country? Because the immediate result of that would be suppression of the people, oppression of their wealth, and their stripping of them their right of free speech, freedom of conscience, freedom of religion. And it would mean the arrogant disregard for law, both God's and man's, by the hierarchy of the Roman Catholic Church. Immunity from crime. That's historically been the case, and certainly we see that today right here in the United States of America. And the case that I always use for the example is the Roman Catholic priest pedophile pandemic. They're not answerable to the civil power. The papacy insists that if charges are brought against the priest, it must be held under the pontifical secret, and that the Pope, the Holy See, is to adjudicate the matter. And it always results in the priest going free and the children being accused as the accusers of the Roman Catholic Church in order to line their pockets with the wealth of the Roman Catholic Church. The victims become the criminals. And in a few cases where a Roman Catholic priest has actually sat before a court, you simply have to understand it was a concession made by the Roman Catholic Church to give the appearance of responsibility, when in fact globally the priests are literally scot-free for what they do to the children around the world. They're immune from the law. They're immune from God's law. They're a law unto themselves, and they are oppressive. And the more power that they get, the more sinful and oppressive they get. We do not want the temporal power of the Pope exercised in the United States of America. And when we find out that our newly elected president receives one of his first phone calls in the Oval Office from the Pope of Rome, the American people ought to protest to the wind. But nary a word is said. And if one does say it, he's persecuted as an anti-Roman Catholic bigot. But that falls flat to the ground in light of history. The greatest threat, says R.W. Thompson, to the continuance of this Protestant constitutional republic is not an offshore threat. It is a domestic threat, and that threat is the same that existed in England and in Germany. The Roman Catholic hierarchy, the Pope of Rome. There's no power on earth, according to R.W. Thompson, that could overthrow our Protestant Constitution and our Protestant way of life and our liberties, but the domestic threat posed by the Roman Catholic Church. It says they also desired that the Mass should be in Latin. Okay? That's the traditionalist Roman Catholics. They are the ones who hold to the Council of Trent. The Council of Trent insisted that the Mass should be in Latin. And if they insist that the Mass should be in Latin, you must know that they believe that Protestants should be extirpated and annihilated as an act of service to God. Okay, these are the Tridentine, the traditionalist Roman Catholics raising up this protest in England. They want canon law to be the law of the land. They want to restore the Mass to Latin. That images should be set up. Idolatry, forbidden in the Scriptures. That the priest should pray for the souls in purgatory, an imaginary place. Purgatory, it does not exist. It's not found anywhere in the Bible. This is just an ancient pagan belief. And that the people should be forbidden to read the Bible. That's what these Tridentine Roman Catholics insisted that Edward VI put in place in England. That the people be forbidden to read the Bible. Now, how can Roman Catholicism be considered by any stretch of the imagination a Christian religion if they forbid the reading of the Bible? The Bible is the enemy of Roman Catholicism. The Bible was suppressed all throughout Roman Catholic history. If the Bible was ever mentioned, it was mentioned only by the priest because they had sole jurisdiction over it. The people couldn't read it. They weren't allowed to possess it. The priest pretended to preach from it, but what they were actually doing is preaching in a dead language the support for the papacy. Roman Catholicism is more best described as popery, Romanism. It is not Christianity. And it says, all these demands being refused, the rebels marched upon and besieged Exeter, which was relieved by the king's troops under Lord Russell when the insurgents were dispersed. Another rebellion was also begun by the papists in Northampton, which was suppressed by the Earl of Warwick. Edward VI did all in his power to promote the cause of the Protestant Reformation by promptly resisting all these revolutionary measures of the papal party, and so far succeeded that the celebrated Confession of Faith, consisting of 42 articles, which was the foundation of the present Church of England, was drawn up by Cranmer and Ridley during his reign. This, says the historian, was the last mortal wound given to the old religion. To Edward VI, therefore, justly belongs the honor of having been the first Protestant king of England, and all true history assigns to him such honesty in the administration of affairs and such purity of personal motive that although he died at the early age of 16 years old and reigned but 7 years, he was enabled by his consistent policy to leave an illustrious record of his virtues, and must ever be spoken of his praise that, youthful as he was, he succeeded in holding in check the bad passions which had held their carnival during the reign of his father, and in putting his foot firmly upon the monster of persecution, the papacy. The rack and the thumbscrew, infernal instruments of the papal Inquisition, were cast aside, and papists were allowed to maintain their religious faith without fear of torture or of the scaffold. Although religious differences may have led to the conviction and execution of his maternal uncle, the Duke of Somerset, yet the young king was constrained to consent to his death because, upon the record of his trial, he appeared guilty of the design to seize upon his own person and the administration of the government, and for these purposes to raise an insurrection in the city of London. When he placed his signature to the death warrant of the Anabaptist Joan Boker, who was convicted of heresy, he did so with tears in his eyes, yielding rather to the persuasions of Cranmer, who had been trained in the school of Henry VIII, than to his own convictions. And it may be fairly inferred that his assent to the subsequent execution of Van Parr, but for heresy, was obtained by the same influence. But these executions the papists did not complain on their own account, saying merely that the reformers were only against burning when they were in fear of it themselves, and availing themselves of them to stir up dissatisfaction and insurrection against the government.